Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the documentation of my mother, who I call a superstar in my life. Miss Lillian Ames, born April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1921, out of a little town called, outside of Brookshire, little town called Patterson. And as my mother reached the age of 6 years old, she lost her father, Frazier Ames. My mother was the only child. She was the baby. She was the last of 3 children. And my other 2 uncles, her other 2 brothers, was by previous marriages. So this is Frazier Ames' first girl. 8 years later, at 13, she lost her mother, which was Miss Rosita Ames. And therefore, her 2 brothers was already grown, and they had already went to the service. So it left her there by herself. And my auntie, which is her auntie, and my great auntie, out of Houston, Texas, called Mother Hall. Rosie Hall is her name, but they call her Mother Hall. She was a fortune teller, and she was a good fortune teller. She had a lot of rich white clientele out of riverboats, and a lot of rich millionaires that would come there to get their fortune told. During them days in the 40s and the 30s, people looked upon fortune tellers as though they really knew what was going on, and they did. And my mother's auntie, which was Rosie Howell, was good at what she did. She even trained people like Mother McGowan, who later became real famous in fortune telling. And when her auntie, Rosie Hall, and her husband, George Hall, they couldn't have any kids. So they was delighted to adopt my mother and bring her to Houston. And her auntie, Rosie Hall, not only was a fortune teller, but she was a well-to-do black lady in the early 20s and 30s. She was well-to-do. She had a lot of rent houses in the back of the house. And her husband, which was Joe Hall, he was a big-time worker at United Steel and had been there for over 20 years. So they was well established. And they welcomed my mother with open arms. And my mother was coming up by herself, no brothers and sisters, when she was a teenager. And Aunt Rosie, her auntie, enrolled her in Jack Yates at the age of 15. And she graduated in Jack Yates. And at the age of 18, she got married. She met my father, which was Robert Leon Williams, Sr. He was a well-to-do businessman. He operated a shoe shop. He could repair shoes, he could shine shoes, and he can also make shoes. That's how good he was. Had his own shoe shop and his own business, and was stabilized in his business, and had a good clientele in 3rd Ward. So therefore, in 1939, my mother married, and she became Lillian Ames Williams. And it took them 9 years because they thought they would never be able to have children. My dad only had 1 sister and no brothers. And his sister had already had 4 kids, 3 girls and a boy. My mother, when she came down here, she met a good friend of hers, which later on became like her sister, Miss Myrtle Neal. And they were good friends. And Miss Neal had already had 4 children. And my mother and them still hadn't had no children. So in 19 47, my mother was pregnant. And therefore, in 1948, of March of 19, she gave birth to her only child, and that was me, Robert Leon Williams, Jr. And yes, I was spoiled. And my mother did not know the kind of work, because she was anticipating on a girl. Her sister-in-law had 3 girls. Her best friend, Miss Eula May, had 3 girls. So she just knew she wanted a girl. She never had a sister. So she wanted a girl, and so happened I came out to be a boy. And this is what Uncle Joe wanted, a grandson. And Uncle Joe, he wore the pants in the house. After my mother and my father got divorced, when I was about 4 years old, and my father and my mother told me that she was too young when she got married. She knew my daddy was a good man. But my daddy had left and moved out of Houston, moved to San Antonio, where he met my stepmother, Miss Eugenia Williams, which at that time was Miss Eugenia Warren. And she was more to me than a stepmother. She was a mother indeed, especially when I lost my mother. But as I was coming up, I was a bad boy. And my mother knew I was spoiled because my Uncle Joe had already spoiled me. And she tried to unspoil me, but it was a little bit too late. I was already set in having my way. And if I didn't have my way, I had a way of cursing a lot. And she named me Boo. The reason why she named me Boo, because every time they would say Boo, I would jump. So they said that Boo was scared. So we don't name him Boo. Because every time you say Boo, he gets his attention and jumps up and starts crying. So then, when my mother and my father got divorced, my mother had to get a job because my father, he the one paid the bills and had my mother doing the housework, taking care of me. My mother didn't have to work. But as my daddy moved on and my mother moved on, I stayed with my mother and my uncle Joe Hall, 3816 Cobb Street, where now TSU Dormitory has taken over there, that whole neighborhood. And as I stayed there on Cobb Street, raised up by my mother and Uncle Joe, my mother always told me that it's one thing she would like for me to do. No matter how bad I was, please go and finish high school and get your high school diploma. That's why you see my high school graduate picture behind me and my mother. And I say this in the documentation of my mother because she was strong. She was a very strong lady. She started working at the Veteran Hospital around about 1953, 54. And she worked, and when my Uncle Joe died, my mother took over the rent houses, and she was already doing all the rent work. My Uncle Joe passed in 1956. And my mother got remarried to my stepfather, which was Casey Jones, which was also worked at the VA hospital. He went to Phyllis Wheatley. And when he and my mother got married, he made my mother happy. And he had a drinking problem, but he never hit my mother because my mother was strong. She was raised up with 2 mean brothers. One definitely mean brother was a man, my uncle, Bailey Moore. And my other uncle which was KJ Byers, which was her closest brother, and which was my closest uncle. And when my mother got married to Casey Jones, he did have a drinking problem, but he never drunk all his money away because he let my mother manage his money. During them days, women would manage their husband's money, and they would bring all the money home. And he was more than a stepfather to me. He never whooped me or touched me, anything. And he tried to do the things that I always thought that he would think that would make me happy. And he was a good stepfather to me. Then my mother beginning to bloom out to what she wanted to be now. And she started getting a bunch of ladies together, her friends and stuff that she had met down the road and at work at the VA. And my mother decided to make them a group and a club they called the Evernet Socialite Club. It was a bunch of ladies, and they would have meetings every week. And then on special events such as Juneteenth, my mother and them would book shows. My mother was the president of the club. They would book shows at the El Dorado Ballroom, the Grand Oaks Ballroom, and different other places where they can have a show and dance. And would book big stars such as Bobby Bland, B.B. King, Joe Hinton, Joe Hughes, Big Joe Turner. All them people I had already met as a kid. And life is so short. You have the sudden death. That's when people are here today and they're gone tomorrow. Then you have that slow death. People stay in the hospital, and, and they gradually lose their strength, and eventually they lose their life and they pass on. But that sudden death is so hard and it hits you so quick, you can't believe it happened. Because Monday, June 21st, 1971, me and my mother was hugging. She was kissing me and telling me how much she loved me. And I'm saying, Mama, I'm a grown man. Don't be hugging and kissing on me like this. She said, no, you all I got. And you know what, boo? I'm all you got. And I want to tell you, I love you. And I replied back to her, I love you too, Mama. And that Tuesday morning, that was Monday night when she told me that. Tuesday morning, a friend of mine came out there. I was working for Rainbow on the bread truck. A friend of mine came out there and told me, she said, man, Miss Lillian got shot. I need you to go to the house. I left the bread truck there and told the person at Rainbow to come get the truck after I got home and told him what happened. I went to Bentar and I watched my mother on that machine. And they asked me, did I want to keep her on the machine? And my first cousin, Hester Godfrey, had already got married. And they said if she lives, she'll be a vegetarian. My cousin Hester said, boo, let her live. I'll take care of Annie. Annie is all I got. And I went home. And when I got home late on that evening, I knew she wasn't going to make it. I had a feeling. I'd already prepared myself for it. And later on at 5 o'clock, they say, well, your mother already left.